Every year, Paris welcomes more than 30 million visitors. The city of light, the city of love, the most beautiful avenue in the world, the Champs-Élysées. And beneath their feet, in the dark, lie the bones of 6 million people. Tourists photograph the boulevards, never knowing that under the pavement stretch kilometers of tunnels packed with skulls and bones. Down there, side by side, rest the remains of Robespierre, of Danton, and of the storyteller who wrote Cinderella. A whole underground kingdom of the dead beneath the city of the living. How they got there is a story of its own, and we'll come to it. But it's just one of the secrets of a city that has rebuilt and erased itself many times over. Because the elegant Paris of boulevards you picture is younger than it looks, and beneath it lie the layers of other, earlier Parises, Roman, medieval, filthy, and cramped. To understand how today's city grew out of them, we have to go back to the beginning, to a small island in a river. For centuries, the early Paris could only be imagined. From chronicles, excavations, and old engravings. But now, using AI trained on historical images, we can see it as it once was. Roman Lutetia, Gothic spires above the mud, a city under demolition, the boulevards of Haussmann. It all began with an island. In the middle of the Seine, where the river spreads wide, lies a long wooded island, the future Île de la Cité. On it, even before the Romans, lived a Celtic tribe, the Parisii. They lived by the river. Their trading fleet worked the Seine 100 years before Caesar arrived, carrying tin, timber, and grain, and taking a toll from everyone who crossed the river by their bridge. An island in the middle of the water was easy to defend, and the river fed them. That was the whole secret of the place. In 52 BC, the Romans seized the island. Caesar's general Labienus crushed the Parisii fleet of 50-odd boats. And on the site of the Celtic settlement, the Romans built their own city, Lutetia. They came down off the island onto the left bank, high, dry, made of limestone. The right bank was a marsh, and for now, they left it alone. On the slope of a hill rose an amphitheatre for 17,000 spectators. Think about that. The amphitheatre held more people than lived in the whole city. The Romans built for growth, with an empire's worth of room to spare, and below it steamed the baths. Under vaults that still stand in Paris today, water splashed, steam rose, and the air smelled of warm stone. That same Lutetian limestone they would later build half the city from. Water was carried in by an aqueduct from 26 kilometers away. These baths and this amphitheater would later sink underground, and one day greengrocers' stalls would stand over the Roman vaults, and the shoppers would never guess they were walking over the bathhouse of an imperial city. So it would always be, each new Paris, laid down over the one before. Lutetia was an ordinary Roman town on the edge of the empire, and then the empire fell, and the city ran back to its island. When Rome collapsed, the barbarians came down the roads of Gaul. The open left bank, with its baths and amphitheater, became dangerous, and the people of Lutetia did what every city under threat does. They pulled back into the most defensible place they had. They returned to the island. Over 3 centuries, the city lost more than half its people, from 80,000 down to 30. The amphitheater was abandoned, its stones later carted off for walls. The great city shrank to a scrap of land in the middle of a river. But it was the island that saved it. When a fleet of Norsemen came up to Paris in 885, 700 longships. The citizens blocked the arms of the Seine with heavy chains on floats and held them off. The water that had once fed the Parisii was now a moat. The city survived, clinging to its island like a life raft. And having survived, it began to grow again. This time, into the largest city in Europe. By the mid-13th century, more than 200,000 people lived in Paris, a number so vast for the age that they reached for images to express it. Like grains in an ear of wheat, like hairs on a head. The city outgrew the island and spilled onto both banks. And each bank found a role it holds to this day. The island, power. The left bank, the university, the Sorbonne, the Latin of scholars. The right bank, drained at last of its marshes, trade, the market, money. 3 Parises in one. And to protect this sprawling mass, around 1190, King Philip Augustus ringed the city with its first true stone wall, 10 meters high, with dozens of towers. And at the western gate, to cover a weak spot, he built a fortress with a round keep. The fortress was called the Louvre. Inside the walls rose a cathedral that would take longer to build than 5 generations live. Notre-Dame was begun in 1163 and finished only 182 years later. The man who laid the first stone and the man who saw the last were separated by nearly 2 centuries. Above the island, above a forest of masts and bell towers, rose a Gothic ship with flying buttresses and stained glass windows the size of a house. But the beauty ended at the cathedral door. Medieval Paris was cramped and appallingly filthy. Narrow, crooked streets, sewage running underfoot, dung and mud and beggars everywhere. Ugly black houses. Air thick with stench. That is how it was remembered. People crossed the city, stepping over the refuse, and over all that filth thundered a bridge. The Pont Notre-Dame was built up with some 60 houses, their numbers in gold on a red ground. Day and night, heavy carts rumbled across it, gates creaked, traders shouted. To live on a bridge over the river was a mark of status, until the next flood swept it away. The city kept swelling, and the kings had to keep ringing it with new walls. In the 14th century, King Charles V ran a new wall along the right bank, nearly 5 kilometers, from the Louvre to the eastern marshes. And to cover the eastern gate, he built a mighty fortress with 8 round towers. They called it the Bastille. Remember that word. 400 years later, this fortress would decide the fate of the nation. For now, the city fed from one enormous belly, the market of Les Halles. The belly of Paris, as it would later be called. At dawn, endless lines of carts streamed in. A mountain of cabbages rose beside a mountain of fish. Live lobsters died on the marble. Blood from the slaughterhouses ran down the cobbles. The city ate, and the sound of it carried for blocks. And this growing, noisy, filthy city kept choking on its own blood. On the night of the 24th of August, 1572, the bell of the church of Saint-Germain rang out. At that signal, Paris was sealed against outsiders, and the slaughter began. The Saint Bartholomew's night drowned the streets in Protestant blood. A city that could feed and build could also kill, fast, and in bulk. Out of that blood rose a king who, for the first time, treated the city like a doctor. Henri IV gave Paris its first bridge with no houses, the Pont Neuf. That sounds like a trifle, but it was a revolution. For the first time, The bridge opened a view of the river and the city. Parisians saw their Paris whole for the first time, not through a slit between shops, but in its full width. On the bridge crowded tooth pullers, acrobats, traders. Below it, the Seine rolled on. But no sooner had the city begun to flourish than it was abandoned. In 1682, King Louis XIV gathered his court and moved 20 kilometers away to Versailles, and Paris was left without a king for over 100 years. The largest city in Europe was handed over to itself. A bitter parody of a prayer went round the streets. Our Father, which art at Versailles, hallowed be not thy name. The king gazed at his fountains in his country palace, while the capital stewed in its own juices, grew, festered, and stored up anger. And so, this abandoned capital, by the 18th century, became the largest and the filthiest city in the world. While the king strolled at Versailles, his capital rotted. A writer named Mercier walked this Paris street by street and wrote it all down. And the picture is monstrous. Picture an ordinary morning for a Parisian. You step out into utter filth. Crossing the street in thin shoes without sinking was a special civic art. A carriage tears past, nearly killing you. Carriages crushed pedestrians almost daily. From a side alley comes the corpse stench of a slaughterhouse. And at home, you drink water from a well, not knowing that sewage from the cesspits seeps into it, and that the baker mixed your bread with the very same water. Over all of this hung the hum of 1,000 cafes. By the century's end, there were more than 1,000. Over a cup of coffee, in clouds of tobacco, Parisians read pamphlets and argued politics. The city was choking on filth. But in those smoke-filled rooms, something was brewing that would soon explode. And in the middle of the city rotted the worst place of all, the cemetery of the innocents. And here we are, back at the bones we began with. A small city graveyard had buried Parisians for 800 years and overflowed so badly that the ground rose 2 meters above the streets, and the stench of decay poisoned the whole quarter. One day a wall gave way, and the rotting bodies spilled into the cellars of the neighboring houses. It could not be borne. And in 1786, the bones began to be carted away. By night, on wagons under black palls, into the old quarries beneath the city. And so, under Paris, the catacombs were born. An underground city of the dead, 6 million skeletons, the very ones the tourists walk above today. Did you know that the famous catacombs of Paris began with an overflowing graveyard? Tell me in the comments. For a lot of people, this comes as a complete surprise. But the filth and the bones were only a symptom. The city was suffocating, and the anger built until it broke loose. On the 14th of July, 1789, the crowd marched on the Bastille, that same fortress of Charles V. They stormed it as a symbol of royal tyranny, though inside sat just 7 prisoners, 4 forgers, 1 dissolute nobleman, and 2 madmen. It didn't matter. What mattered was the stone. The fortress was being torn down that very day, pulled apart block by block, the rubble sold off as souvenirs. The king lost not a prison, he lost a stronghold in the heart of the city. And then, Paris itself became a scaffold. On the square now called Concorde, they set up the guillotine. In 10 months of terror, 3,000 people were executed in Paris alone. The blood by the platform had no time to soak in. The drums drowned out the cries. The crowd counted heads. Here the king and queen lost their heads too. But most of all, The revolution rewrote the city itself. Its stones. Streets were renamed on the fly, several times over. Churches, holy places only yesterday, were turned into warehouses and temples of reason. The stone kings of Notre-Dame had their heads knocked off, and the cathedral itself fell so derelict it was nearly sold for scrap, like a heap of rock. In the royal tomb of Saint-Denis, the graves were opened, and the bones of the kings of France tipped into a common pit. 1,000 years of monarchy poured onto the ground in a few days. A writer returning from exile found a strange city, empty bell towers without bells, graveyards without crosses, beheaded statues of saints. The revolution didn't just change who ruled, it erased the city's old face. Out of that chaos came a man who loved order, Napoleon. He began to bring the capital to its senses, physically. For the first time in history, clean water was piped into Paris, along a new canal, and citizens who had drunk from the muddy Seine for centuries could finally wash. He clad the riverbanks in stone quays and raised the Arc de Triomphe, but underneath, Paris was still the same, a medieval labyrinth of narrow, dark, rotting streets. And that labyrinth had turned deadly. In the cramped quarters, with no water and no air, cholera flared. A single epidemic mowed down thousands in a matter of months. And the narrow streets were a paradise for rebels. They were easily blocked with barricades, and again, the authorities lost control of the city. The old Paris was killing with disease and threatening revolt. It needed more than repair. It needed surgery. And in 1853, a surgeon was found. His name was Baron Haussmann, and he did to Paris what no one had ever done to a city. He tore it down and built it again. It was a war against the old world. People left for work in the morning and came back in the evening to find their street gone. It simply wasn't there anymore. Take in the numbers. Haussmann demolished 27,500 old houses, more than stood in all of medieval Paris. Through the ancient labyrinth, he cut straight, wide boulevards, lined with lime trees. And he cut them with a double purpose. Down a wide, straight boulevard, air and light flow freely against disease. And so does artillery, freely, against the barricades. Beauty, hygiene, and control, in a single blueprint. Along the boulevards rose identical 6-story buildings of pale limestone, with wrought iron balconies and zinc roofs. There it is, the eternal Paris of the postcards. It isn't even 170 years old. It was cut through the living body of the old city, and poets mourned the Paris that Haussmann killed. For half a century, the city was one vast building site. Dust, noise, the exposed walls of demolished houses, still papered in color, where people had lived only yesterday. And beneath the boulevards, Haussmann's engineer Belgrand laid what the city had never had, a modern sewer. Hundreds of kilometers of underground tunnels, whole rivers of waste hidden below ground. The very filth of Mercier that had run through the streets for centuries finally went down. And over the new opera, a marvel happened. When they dug the foundations, they struck groundwater they couldn't pump out, so they sealed it in an underground cistern. Beneath the Opera Garnier, a man-made lake still ripples to this day. Later, a writer would house his Phantom of the Opera in it. If this story has gripped you, share the video with your friends. It really helps us make new ones. Haussmann's city turned out so beautiful that they wanted to show it to the whole world. For the World's Fair of 1889, the engineer Eiffel raised an iron tower over Paris, 300 meters, the tallest structure on Earth. Parisians were horrified, called it hideous, and demanded it be torn down. And here's what almost no one knows. The tower really was going to be demolished. It was built temporarily, for 20 years. Radio saved it. They put an antenna on top, and tearing it down became a waste. So the temporary tower stayed forever and became the face of the city. And on the hill of Montmartre, among old mills and vineyards, the artists settled in. The air smelled of turpentine and oil paint, and a new art was being born. Underground, the metro opened. With its green wrought iron arches, Paris entered the new century as the most fashionable city in the world. This dazzling city passed through the trial of the 20th century. In 1940, the Germans entered Paris. The city went still for 4 years, dark and silent. There was no petrol, and through the emptied streets, where engines had once roared, now came only the squeak of bicycle chains. Bicycle taxis appeared, gaunt Frenchmen pedaling, hauling well-fed occupiers in their carts. The great city was being pedaled around on a bicycle. And after the war, Paris reached up and out again. On the western edge rose a glass city of towers, La Défense, a new business district where the wind whistles through the faces of the skyscrapers. And in the very heart of the old city, they opened a building turned inside out, the Pompidou Center. Its pipes and escalators hung on the outside, on the facade. Parisians were scandalized, just as they once were by the Eiffel Tower. Old stone and daring new stood side by side again, as they always had. And today, if you walk through Paris, its whole life stands in layers. The Ile de la Cité, where the Parisii sat, the baths of Roman Lutetia under a boulevard, fragments of Philip Augustus's wall in the courtyards, Notre-Dame, which burned in 2019 and was rebuilt in 5 years, the way the city has always rebuilt itself. The boulevards of Haussmann, the iron of Eiffel, the glass of La Défense, and deep beneath it all, the catacombs. 6 million Parisians, who lived in the earlier vanished Parises, lie beneath the Paris of today. We began with the City of Light, beneath which lies a kingdom of the dead. Now you know, it's not some grim accident, just one more layer. Paris has erased and rebuilt itself many times, shrinking onto an island, drowning in filth, going under Haussmann's hammer, and each time it rose again, more beautiful than before. That same island still lies in the middle of the Seine, where the Parisii once took a toll from the bridge. And above it stands a city that has outlived Rome, the barbarians, the revolution, and its own demolition. And it remains the most beautiful city in the world. If you enjoyed this journey through the centuries, subscribe. It really helps the channel. More cities are coming, ones we'll bring back to life. And in the comments, tell us, which city's story should we show next?